Early morning on Leblon Beach, and security outnumbers the spectators awaiting the elite runners taking part in the Rio Marathon. Staged along one of the most beautiful stretches of coastline in Latin America, both the location and the race itself reflect the infrastructure problems facing Brazil. Sitting inside a football stadium diverts one's gaze from the gaps between rich and poor. The marathon route affords no such comfort.
We've had many problems of, all the way from white elephants or incomplete white elephants. The choices sometimes have been bad. In the case of the World Cup, it's true that the 12 stadiums or arenas were built. Most of them look beautiful, but you talk about the rest of the infrastructure, which was promised, particularly on the urban mobility side, very little was done.
Financing development is indeed a marathon task. The pain is by no means shared. Waste, mismanagement, corruption and incompetence combine to raise political discontent.
E com ano em que houve Copa do Mundo sediada pelo Brasil e que a gente tem eleições presidenciais, o mercado tem discutido muito a questão de expectativas também. Então, há certo sentimento de pessimismo na indústria, no setor produtivo, porque quer ver reformas que a gente historicamente não conseguiu fazer, reforma tributária, reforma política.
The proximity of the favelas to this, one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in the country, highlights the expectation gaps. The mood here remains one of gritty determination, informed as much by hope as expectation. High above Leblon, the scale of the task becomes all too apparent. The famous statue of Christ looks out over a city that finds itself increasingly unable to cope. As the country slips into recession, a circuit breaker must be found.
If we believe in global capital markets, which I do, and I think global capital markets can be a tremendous force for good in the world. It can spread capital, it can enrich economies. You can't develop an economy unless you have a capital market.
The International Organization of Securities Commissions, or IOSCO, sees this as key to legitimacy. For countries such as Brazil, it has become a political imperative. The task is now to link domestic and international reform agendas. A core theme of the upcoming IOSCO conference here in Rio de Janeiro is the development of market-based financing. It's all part of a strategy to rejuvenate and rapidly expand the capital markets, linked to a reconception of regulatory purpose. Capital market expansion requires a rationale, and the rationale here is the productive allocation of capital to serve broader societal aims. Markets provide a mechanism to close the gap between rich and poor. They also have the capacity to kickstart a stalled economy. It's an agenda with global application.
The core agenda is looking to the future. After the financial crisis of 2008, we all, regulators and all agents in the markets, had to ask ourselves what would be our role, and in some way redesign what we were supposed to do. But I think it's time now to look to the future. And so we are going to basically be talking how the capital markets, what should be the role of the capital markets in supporting economic growth, economic development. And I think this is going to be the core. We want to look to the future.
The future involves reducing dependence on foreign direct investment. Down in the docks, preparations are being made to launch the latest rig to explore the vast oil and gas reserves. This vessel, built in China and now finishing a refit here in Rio's port, is an example of the type of infrastructure funding that Brazil alone cannot afford. Tapping the capital markets can reduce reliance on both foreign and domestic state-owned capital.
That, for example, is a great opportunity for capital markets to play a more active role. We still have places where the development banks play a key role. I think we believe that development bank should be an important tool, but they should also work together with the capital markets in order to promote this growth.
In this complex dance, finding a way to translate potential into concrete improvements in living standards has become an imperative for both sides of politics. As critics concede, the sovereign has reached the limits of capacity. Time is of the essence. Although there have been no repeat of the riots that marred preparations for the World Cup, there can be no doubting the unease.
At this juncture, the National Development Bank will not have the fiscal space, because a lot of resources are coming from Treasury in the last few years, will not have enough fiscal space starting next year, or actually starting right now, 2014, mainly 2015 onwards.
So the opportunity exists?
The opportunity exists.
This can be a tremendous force for good. But unless we have institutions at the global level which can ensure that good standards are being applied, then I worry, because then it's what the French would call chacun pour soi, everybody for themselves.
This is a very real challenge for IOSCO, not least because what was once presented as best practice has been undermined by a series of scandals that postdate the global financial crisis. Here at the International Organization of Securities Commission's headquarters in Madrid, regulators from across the world have converged to map out a new strategy to deal with the burgeoning investigation into the corruption of LIBOR and associated benchmarks and broader questions of currency manipulation in the Forex markets. The extent of the misconduct uncovered is both shocking and highly disturbing. It suggests that a cartel has been operating at the highest echelons of global finance.
I think the collusion one is the elephant in the room at the moment, to be honest with you. Yeah. But I think it's only just starting to emerge that there is collusion issues here.
And can we rely then on the stated willingness of major financial institutions that they are recognizing the need to change? Can we just rely on self-certification, or does there have to be more?
Look, I think, no, I think you've got to do more than that. I think one of the things I think is a good idea is to do stakeholder surveys, because, you know, I think, for example, coming and talking to the regulators as part of a stakeholder survey to see what they think is a damn good idea, to see what they think is your culture. Because I'm sure that, for example, you know, some of the people that we regulate, I'd probably give a 4 out of 10, and others I'd give an 8 out of 10. And the one who has 4 out of 10 probably thinks they do a good job.
And to what extent then can one make that information public in terms of your rating of somebody's risk profile as 4 rather than 8? That is actually quite a difficult one. I guess, you know, that if I would say that again, it depends on companies. But you know, if I was running a company, you know, we publish our stakeholder survey at ASIC, all right? It goes online, you know, warts and all. Here's what people think of us. But, you know, I think it's probably a healthy thing, actually, to actually publish it and go, well, here's what our customers think of us, here's what our regulators think of us. That's not a bad accountability and transparency mechanism, frankly.
Right now, the global financial system and its regulators, or its regulatory bodies, have 3 tools in which to ensure implementation of our principles. The first one is color diagrams. The second one is peer pressure. And the third one is prayer. And prayer is probably the strongest of the 3. We have no binding institutions. We have no binding dispute settlement system like the WTO. And the problem today is just about manageable because we have really two big jurisdictions, the EU and the US. Everybody else is caught between those two big institutions. But in 10 or 20 years' time, we're going to have many, many more big capital markets. So what is everybody going to do? Just apply the rules as they see fit? Because that is a recipe for fragmentation.
Fragmentation is accompanied by a decline in trust. Trust is in short supply in the aftermath of financial benchmark scandals that have accrued billions of dollars in fines. It has also called into question stated commitments by financial institutions that they have changed.
Now, here's the challenge with market manipulation. There's a lot of smoke-filled rooms in the world. There are a lot of places in which participants can get together and decide to agree, to conspire, to collude. And obviously that kind of collusion can reduce the integrity of a particular benchmark, for an example. So regulators and governments have attempted over this past period to put in place a system to try and reduce not only the market manipulation, but to enhance the integrity of those benchmarks. And you know very well what IOSCO has achieved in that area in producing an extremely worthwhile paper on benchmarks, and I think is being relied on to a great extent globally. Bottom line is this, though: manipulation, that's a difficult area. That goes to integrity. That goes to human behavior. That goes to the ability of securities regulators to be able to reduce the opportunity for human behavior to not act in a corrupt manner. And I can tell you that's a challenge that we've had through eternity. And regulation can only go so far to deal with that issue, but it's our responsibility to at least try and address it.
The thing that changed, the real game changer, was effectively the conduct scandals, pure conduct scandals in 2012, which the most significant of which was libel, because that's when the focus changed to what's really going on. Yes, we have the safety nets, but what's really going on within financial institutions.
And is that when regulators woke up?
I think that's largely true. And you can see even from, we're sitting in IOSCO headquarters at the moment, you can see even from IOSCO's perspective, I think and its members did a heck of a lot of work as a result of that to come up with things like the benchmark reform and such like. So I think, yes, I think that's when regulators did wake up. But there's a long journey, because this trust deficit is something which now informs the entire relationship between many financial sector institutions.
But if, in actual fact, it is a cartel, is that global agenda that we've seen, which has been, people have labored on for years, yeah, right? Ultimately, has it been based on a false assumption?
Possibly. And there's an aspect of this which I think is really important, which is when you're dealing with financial services, the subject matter is deeply obscure, even for regulators. We struggle to understand, putting it in simple terms, what's going on. Now, if we struggle to understand what's going on within a single financial institution, trying to understand what's going on as between institutions, recognizing that the big actors in the financial world are actually relatively few. And we also have this perverse thing happening, which is that the safety nets, they've been put in place, have favored the growth of large institutions. They get even bigger. So even bigger institutions that should not fail, or there's a fear about them failing. So you end up with something that looks a little bit like the sort of ecology which is conducive to anti-competitive conduct. It must do, if you basically have a regulatory system that favors the large and favors the few.
And is there the political will, do you think, to actually address the elephant in the room?
No.
And why is that?
Because I think if you address the elephants in rooms, firstly, once you've unveiled them, maybe decided it's there, are usually too heavy to move. And if you try to move them, you're going to break lots of things.
So let's talk about the LIBOR scandal and associated manipulation scandals. Do you think, has the issue been dealt with, or is there more to come?
I'd like to be able to say the issue has been dealt with, because clearly what happened in LIBOR was around the 2008 vintage, where there were lots of bad things happening in markets. But the truth is, our current investigations relate to recent activities in the last 2 years. So they relate to things that, frankly, people should have known better, having seen what's happened with LIBOR, but actually the practices are still present. And that's a disappointment, and it's unfortunate, but we'll flush those out as well.
Disappointment, unfortunate. People might think that's an inappropriate response, or not a response which is sufficient given the severity of the crisis.
The difficulty, frankly, is a lot of the activity that we're seeing now is not in what's traditionally been a regulated space. So all of us, every jurisdiction has a legal structure it has to work within, and we have a legal structure we have to work within. That dictates what is within our power to oversee, and some things are not within our power. And so in a sense, we rely therefore on the banks to oversee the non-regulated part in the same way that they would oversee the regulated part. And so the disappointment is that, well, they've just not done that, which is why we've had to go in and say quite strong action.
Now, they haven't done that because they're unwilling to do it, or they're incapable of doing it? Is it a consequence of very complex organisations, that these organisations are too complex for anybody to know what's going on?
In reality, I think it's all of those. Obviously, if people are unwilling to do it, then we take a really tough line with those. Very often, and it's a bandwidth question. There's a lot of change that we're working through at the moment, and within, particularly in the trading rooms of most investment banks, there are subcultures that exist, and that subculture is different whether you're in the credit derivatives desk, or whether you're in the spot forex desk or the commodities desk. But all of those subcultures have traits which have been developed over a number of years, sometimes decades, which under today's microscope just don't stand scrutiny. And all of them need to be addressed. And I guess the issue is how quickly you get around to addressing all of those subcultures.
Well, we've tried, but with tools which are probably adequate to formally regulate it, meaning giving people the obligation to explain what they do, how they do it, and why they do it. But to basically change their mind, I mean, just can't do it. So you can put into place mechanisms which may reduce the temptation to not to cheat, but to get more, or to go outside the ethical and moral rules.
So ultimately then, what you're suggesting is perhaps if we think that formal rules will be enough, you're suggesting that formal rules simply won't be enough. They'll be transacted around.
They're not enough, I agree. They'll be transacted around what you can do as supervisor, because, I mean, we do a few rules, but that's not the main thing you can do. Then you have to be more intrusive in your supervision, meaning you have to go on or send people in, for example, audit firms, to check what is really done. It's difficult. You have then to be critical to the answers you receive and to discuss it with people. And we're training as supervisors our people to do that, and not to be just satisfied by the answers they get.
There is this big discussion about risk management and how the banks and non-banks also have to change their mentality in terms of creating and enhancing the risk management culture. Because at the end of the day, this type of thing comes up when you don't have the right risk framework in place.
And it also happens if you've got an emaciated conception of what corporate responsibility is.
Exactly. Which is also a result of not having the right risk management framework, right? Because if you have the right risk management framework, one of the things that you have to ensure is that you have the right corporate responsibility and transparency and the right levels of accountability in the marketplace. So that's why I strongly believe that we have to work very hard in spreading a risk management culture from a proactive point of view, and for the banks and also for the non-banks.
back in the real world, the demise of trust coincides with a rapid expansion of trading networks that link the emerging South, most notably through the development of what Stephen King of HSBC has termed a new turbocharged Southern Silk Route.
Uma novidade em política internacional esse ano foi a criação do Banco dos BRICS, em uma reunião aqui no Brasil, e foi assinada por Brasil, China, Índia, Rússia e África do Sul. E isso é uma tentativa desses países de um protagonismo maior no mercado internacional. E a gente sabe que tem instituições muito atuantes, né, há muito tempo, o FMI, o Banco Mundial, mas que há uma grande carência de investimento em infraestrutura no mundo todo. Então, alguns apoiam, acham que é necessário, outros acham que não é tão necessário, mas o fato é que é uma tentativa dos países emergentes de ter um papel maior nesse financiamento à infraestrutura e, sobretudo, em países que têm muita carência disso e acabam não conseguindo tanto acesso ao mercado de capitais.
The development of the capital markets reduces the power imbalances inherent in such a strategy.
There are sound strategic reasons for such an approach. First, it reduces reliance on the banking sector, a banking sector which has seen the emergence of China as an important player here in Brazil. And as in other countries, China's going global approach has raised real concern about the dangers of a new mercantilism.
In the coming years, I would say the Chinese more generally, I would say, are becoming far more sophisticated as investors, not only from a purely financial standpoint, but also politically. You know, they are perceiving there are certain areas which are a bit more controversial, so I think they are really thinking through the consequences of moves into those more controversial areas, and there are areas which are financially quite attractive, economically attractive, and less controversial.
For a country that necessitates inward investment, managing that challenge is one of the most pressing issues facing society. To succeed, it must align international objectives with its own.
The market works, but it's about how you put the right nudges in place to make sure the market achieves the outcomes that you want it to achieve.
But for you to achieve those outcomes, you have to clearly define purpose.
Correct.
Okay, so what ultimately could or should the purpose of the capital markets be?
Right, well, I think the capital markets is there to serve the real economy. So basically, and I think we don't ask enough often about why financial regulation exists. Well, my view about the why it exists in capital markets is to enable basically capital to be formed by accessing investors, and so that issuers who want to access capital can access it. That's what markets are about, right? It's having end investors and end issuers. And then in the middle are the gatekeepers who facilitate the system. But basically, they don't have jobs if the people on either side here are not providing money and then accessing the capital market. So if this doesn't work, then the system doesn't work, and therefore what we don't have is capital to fund economic growth. And then that ends up with effects on living standards, etc. So it's very critical what we do. At the end of the day, it's about basically the well-being of countries in terms of actually funding their economies.
We just had last year a discussion what would be the role of the Brazilian regulator in the next 10 years. A very important piece of this strategic document was based on discussions we had with the market, and we got feedback from the market of what we should be doing, what are their main issues, main questions. So we had a special group discussing with the market, getting feedback from the market.
So you get buy-in from the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's a way of putting it. I think it's very important that the regulator, in order to be active, in order to be effective, has to understand what the market's needs are.
Understanding what the markets need requires navigating an exceptionally tricky path in which the eddies of expectation condition the behaviour of markets. The IOSCO conference here in Brazil offers an opportunity for a revitalization of capital market regulation that extends far beyond the Latin American shoreline. In a world in which fragmentation dynamics are as powerful as coordination, the winner will be the one that reduces externalities, delivers social objectives, and embeds restraint. The challenge is as important for IOSCO as it is for Brazil itself.